Oh yeah, I brought him along with me.
Don't we have that project due tomorrow?
Oh yeah, we should really get started on that.
Who has joints?
Don't worry about it, Fez. I have some right here.
Not that type of joint, Hyde. Talking about joints, baby. The first of 2 and more banks in the...
Oh, those type of joints.
Yeah, tell us more about that, Eric.
Okay, so joints have 2 main functions: to let us move and to hold our skeleton together. Joints are kind of the weakest part of the skeleton, but they're still surprisingly strong to resist tearing and crushing.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, I remember that from class. I also remember them talking about fibrous joints. In fibrous joints, the bones are joined by fibrous tissue, namely dense fibrous connective tissue, and no joint cavities present. There are 3 types of fibrous joints, including sutures, syndesmosis, and gomphosis. For example,
Oh, Donna.
sutures happen between bones of the skull. The wavy articulation bone edge engages and the junction is completely filled by a minimal amount of very short connective tissue fibers that are continuous with the periosteum. The product of that is nearly rigid splices that knit the bones together, but still allow the skull to expand as the brain grows during youth. At one point, the skull bones join into a single unit. Because movement of the cranial bones would damage the brain, the movable nature of sutures is protective adaptation. Syndesmosis. In syndesmosis, the bones are connected specifically by ligaments, cords, or bands of fibrous tissue. Even with the connective fibers being longer than sutures vary in length, the amount of movement allowed depends on the length of the connecting fibers, and slight to considerable movement is possible. On the other hand, the fibers of the ligament-like interossous membrane connecting the radius and ulna along their length are long enough to permit rotation of the radius around the ulna, and the joint is diarthric. A gomphosis is a peg and socket fibrous joint. An example is the articulation of a tooth with its bony alveolar socket. The fibrous connection in this case is a ligament.
Fibrous, like toast, I want toast.
You want to hear a better name? Cartilaginous joints.
Cartilaginous. What a silly word.
They're actually kind of cool. They're bones connected by cartilage. They don't have a joint cavity. And they're really rigid.
Okay, it's my turn.
Damn, Jackie! Let me finish!
Yeah, Jackie, let him finish.
As I was saying, there are 2 types of cartilaginous joints, synchondroses and symphyses. In synchondroses, plates of hyaline cartilage unite the bones at synchondrosis, or a junction of cartilage. An example of synchondrosis is the epiphyseal plate in long bones. In symphyses, the articular surfaces of the bones are covered with articular cartilage, which is fused into an intervening plate of fibrocartilage. Since fibrocartilage is compressive and resilient, it's like a shock absorber, and it only allows for a limited amount of movement in the joint. For example, the intervertebral joints and the pubic symphysis of the pelvis.
Wow, Kelso, I didn't know you were so smart.
Nah, I'm totally just reading from my notes right now.
Michael, are you done yet?
Yes, Jackie.
Okay, basically, synovial joints are better than the rest because they take up most of the joints in the body. They are those in which the articulating bones are separated by a fluid-containing joint cavity. All synovial joints are freely movable diarthroses and have 6 different features. Articular cartilage covers opposing bone surfaces in a spongy form which keeps the bone from being crushed. Joint synovial cavity is a space containing a small amount of synovial fluid. Articular capsule is where the joint cavity is enclosed by a 2-severed articular capsule. These strengthen the joint so that the bone does not pull apart. A small amount of synovial fluid occupies all free spaces within the joint capsule. Most reinforcing ligaments are capsular, or intrinsic ligaments, which are thickened parts of the fibrous capsule. So people are usually fascinated by double-jointed people when in reality they have the same amount of joints as, the normal amount of people, because it just means that their capsules and joints are more stretchy than average.
So I'm not special?
Yeah, you're really not that special, Fez. The last feature is nerves and blood vessels. Synovial joints are richly supplied with sensory nerve fibers that innervate the capsule. Some of these fibers detect pain. Stretching these structures sends nerve impulses to the central system, resulting in reflexive contraction of muscles surrounding the joint.
Yo, can someone shut Jackie up?
Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm still talking. There are several movements in synovial joints. First are gliding movements, which are the simplest joint movements and occur when one flat bone surface glides over another. Angular movements increase or decrease the angle between two bones. Flexion is a bending movement, typically along the sagittal plane, that decreases the angle of the joint and brings the articulating bones closer together. Extension is the reverse of flexion and occurs at the same joints. It involves movement along the sagittal plane that increases the angle between the articulating bones and typically straightens a flexed limb or body part. Abduction is a movement of a limb away from the midline or a median plane of the body along the frontal plane. So raising the arm laterally would be an example of an abduction. Adduction is the opposite of abduction, so it is the movement of a limb toward the body midline. Anyway, circumduction is moving a limb so that it describes a cone space. Because it consists of flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction performed in succession, it is the quickest way to exercise the many muscles that move the hip and shoulder ball and socket joints. Rotation is the turning of a bone around its own long axis. It is the only movement allowed between the first two cervical vertebrae and is common at the hip and shoulder joints. Rotation may be directed toward the midline or away from it. And that's it for types of movements. Then there are special movements.
Jackie, please don't.
Okay, fine. But we do need to include the types of synovial joints in our project.
Whatever.
Based on synovial joints' shapes, they can be classified further into 6 major categories.
Ugh.
Can you just chill? I'm almost done. Sort of. Anyway, the first synovial joint type is plane joints. Here, the articular surfaces are flat and they allow only non-axial gliding movements. Hinge joints have the cylindrical end of bone conform to a trough-shaped surface on another. They resemble mechanical hinges. In a pivot joint, the rounded end of one bone, articular surface of one bone fits into a complementary depression in another. Saddle joints resemble condyloid joints, but they also allow greater freedom of movement. Each articular surface has both concave and convex areas, so it's shaped like a saddle. In ball and socket joints, the spherical or hemispherical head of the bone articulates with the cup-like socket of another. These joints are multi-axial and freely moving. Okay, I'm done. Michael? But there's also type based on shape.
Okay, boring. I'm gonna tell you what the government doesn't want you to know. You ever wonder what they did with all those soldiers that came back from the war without limbs?
Why no, Hyde? I don't usually think about thousands of dismembered men.
Shut up, Foreman. I was saying that super smart scientist people, well, they started putting like fake joints in the soldiers, right? And just imagine, like in a few years, everyone's walking around with fake robot legs. That's so dystopian, man.
So dystopian.
And in the 60s, this British guy replaced an entire human hip with like this device. It was made of a metal ball on a stem with a cup-shaped plastic socket that was anchored to the pelvis with cement. I don't think you guys know how crazy this is. The man made a fake hip and attached it to the body with cement. Okay, let me explain how the hip works. The hip joint is formed by the articulation of the round head of the femur with the acetabellum of the hip bone. It's a ball and socket joint like the shoulder, but it's not as movable as the shoulder joint. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's pretty movable, but just not as much as your shoulders. You see, this is because the hip joint has very strong ligaments, and its deep socket limits movement. Some of these ligaments are the iliofemoral, the pubofemoral, and the ischiofemoral ligament. These ligaments are arranged in a way that screws the femur head into the acetabellum. That and the muscle tendons that cross the joint and hip provide stability. Okay, enough of all of that. Back to the cool stuff. Did you know there are ways that you can take healthy parts of the bodies and attach them to injured parts of the bodies, and they'll just like grow into each other? They never tell you that at school, man. I'm not learning about that at breakfast. One way is called osteochondral grafting. It's like what I just said. Healthy bone and cartilage are removed from one part of the body and transplanted into the injured point. In autologous chondrocyte implantation, healthy chondrocytes are removed from the body, cultivated in a lab, and then implanted at the damaged joint. Sick.
You Americans talk so much. It's finally Fez's turn to talk about joint diseases and injuries, such as a cartilage tear, which occurs when a meniscus is subjected to compression and shear stress at the same time. Cartilage is an avascular, so it can't repair itself and stays torn. Cartilage fragments can interfere with joint function by locking or binding it, so many just remove it entirely with arthroscopic surgery. In sprains, the ligaments reinforcing the joint are stretched or torn, just like this poor little foot.
Aww.
Partially torn ligaments repair themselves, but it takes a while. When ligaments are too damaged to be repaired, they must be removed and replaced with grafts and substitute ligaments. And then there's dislocations, which occur when bones are forced out of alignment. This is when you hear Americans be like, oh no, I dislocated my shoulder. Did you know that the temporal mandibular joint is the easiest joint to dislocate with the deep yawn?
Cool.
You can at least have a little bit more enthusiasm. There are also inflammatory conditions that affect joints. For example, bursitis and tendonitis are inflammation of the bursa and tendon teeth. An inflammation of the bursa is as easy as leaning on one's elbow for too long. Fun fact about the elbow joint. It's the most prominent of the upper limb joints because it provides a stable and smoothly operating hinge joint that allows flexation and extension. That's something you forgot to mention, Jackie.
See, I would have talked about it, but you guys kept interrupting me.
Oh, but look who's interrupting now. I said good day. Back to Fez. Arthritis describes over 100 different types of inflammatory diseases which have symptoms of pain, stiffness, and swelling. The most common chronic arthritis is osteoarthritis, often called wear and tear arthritis, which is the most common as you get older. It occurs when the protective cartilage that cushions the ends of the bones wears down over time. Rheumatoid arthritis